Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we are going to take a really good look into Ethereum.
Right.
We've got just an absolute mountain of information here. Real-time price charts. We've got years of historical data and some seriously in-depth market analysis.
Yeah.
And all of that so we can bring you the signal and not the noise about what's really happening with the second biggest cryptocurrency in the world right now.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that Ethereum, it's not just another cryptocurrency out there. It's much more than that.
Yeah.
It is really the backbone for so many of these decentralized applications.
Right.
So many things depend on Ethereum and are built upon it.
Yeah.
I mean, DeFi, decentralized finance, think about the whole NFT craze. All of that really wouldn't have been possible, or at least not in the same way without Ethereum.
Yeah, and lately it feels like that's what everyone's talking about is the price.
Right.
And to kind of give you all the lay of the land, Ethereum recently had a pretty significant drop, around 10%, hitting an intraday low of $1,601.
Wow.
Now, this isn't happening in a vacuum. The broader crypto market is experiencing a downturn right now as well.
Right.
And that seems to be connected to, at least some degree, to what we're seeing in the U.S. stock market as well.
Right.
So as we're talking today, April 7th, 2025, the price is kind of hovering around that 1560 to 1570 range.
Okay, so that leads to the big question here.
Yeah.
What's behind this movement? And more importantly, I think, what might the future hold,
Right.
When we look at, trying to understand, these ups and downs and what is it that's really driving these price moves? What are the fundamentals at play and where could things be headed?
Right.
Based on all this expert analysis that we've got.
Yeah. So let's jump right into that recent price action.
Okay.
And what the overall feeling is in the market.
Right.
Just in the last day and over the past week, we've seen some pretty big declines.
Yeah.
We're talking, around 12 to 13%.
That's a pretty significant move.
It really is.
Yeah.
Something you definitely want to pay attention to. And it's leading to, a lot of different thoughts about what might be next for Ethereum.
Sure. It's always, insightful when you see these kind of different perspectives emerge,
Absolutely.
There's these kind of conflicting viewpoints.
Yeah. For instance, even with this dip that we've seen,
Right.
there's still quite a bit of optimism out there.
Okay.
You got Jeff Kendrick, for example, who's even floated the possibility of Ethereum reaching $10,000
Wow.
if there's another Trump presidency.
Okay. Interesting.
And then more in the shorter term, you've got some traders who are looking at, potentially a rebound back up to about $2,400.
All right.
Which is actually more modest than what some were predicting at the end of last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some were saying we'd see 4,000 by the end of 2024.
So 2,400 is kind of a little less ambitious.
Right, exactly. And what's really interesting here is when you compare that optimism with what some of the technical charts are saying. So for example, let's look at the ETH dominance chart.
All right.
Now, for you listening along, think of the ETH dominance chart as showing how Ethereum is performing compared to the rest of the cryptocurrency market.
Okay.
So it's kind of measuring its relative strength.
All right. I gotcha.
And what we're seeing on this chart is something called a descending triangle pattern.
Oh, okay.
And for technical analysts, this ascending triangle pattern can be an indication that ETH's strength relative to other cryptocurrencies might be weakening.
Okay.
Suggesting that potentially there's less confidence in Ethereum compared to some of those other options.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's one way to kind of visualize it. But then when you look at some of the other technical analysis, it paints a different picture.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so you've got TradingView, for example.
Right.
They're pointing to a major support level on the chart.
Okay.
That has historically attracted buyers. And the thinking here is that if buyers step in at this level again, we might see what's called a bullish rally, so like a surge in price.
Gotcha. So it's like they're looking at past price behavior to try to kind of, predict or at least, say what potential scenarios might happen in the future.
Exactly. And then you've got another perspective from TradingView that notes a bearish trend.
Okay.
So a downward trend that's been in place since December 2024.
All right.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
They're also pointing out a potential ascending triangle formation.
Okay.
Now, this is a chart pattern that if the price breaks above its upper boundary, it could signal a move upward.
Interesting. So you've got these kind of competing signals.
Yeah, it's like a tug of war.
Yeah.
Happening on the charts right now.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
We've also got talk of a bullish divergence
All right.
that's been spotted on the monthly chart.
Okay.
Now, for you listening along, what that means is that while the price has been making lower lows, other indicators might suggest that the downward momentum is losing steam.
Okay.
Potentially leading to a pretty big price jump.
Gotcha.
And some analysts are even saying if this plays out, we could see targets, in that $4,000 to $7,500 range.
Wow. That would be a huge move.
It would be massive. But it's important to remember that not everyone is convinced about Ethereum's long-term prospects.
Right.
We're seeing some counter arguments that are raising concerns about how well Ethereum can scale.
Okay.
To handle a really huge number of transactions.
Okay.
And whether it's becoming too centralized.
Interesting.
So, those are some fundamental questions that are definitely weighing on some investors' minds.
Okay.
Even while they acknowledge Ethereum's current, leading position in the market.
Right.
So, these kind of underlying technological, structural questions are a factor in the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then looking at some of the more cautious perspectives.
Okay.
One analysis even called Ethereum's current chart very bad. And specifically, they were highlighting that $1,500 mark as a critical support level.
Okay.
And if the price drops below that, they're suggesting a potentially pretty sharp decline down to maybe even like the $800 to $1,000 range.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark warning about the downside risk that some analysts see.
It really is, and it shows just how important these support levels are for technical traders.
Yeah.
There's also this analysis saying that Ethereum has been in this kind of multi-year sideways trading pattern, characterized by these big swings up and down, and we seem to be testing a major support level right now.
It's like a long period of consolidation with these bursts of energy.
Exactly, yeah. And then on top of that, there's analysis saying that a confirmed major breakout above a certain resistance zone has already happened.
Oh, wow.
With a target of $7,800.
So we've got just a huge range of possibilities being discussed right now.
Massive, yeah. And when you take all of this technical analysis together, the overall summary from TradingView at this point is a strong sell signal. Yeah, and this is based on a bunch of indicators, oscillators, which look at momentum, moving averages, which kind of smooth out price data to identify trends.
Right.
So the technical sentiment right now seems to be leaning towards the bearish side.
Yeah, which seems to line up with what the Fear and Greed Index is saying right now.
Oh, right.
It's sitting at 23, which puts it firmly in that extreme fear category.
Yeah, okay.
And CoinCodex is also saying there's an overall bearish sentiment in the market right now.
So there's definitely a general feeling of, unease.
Yeah, for sure. So let's put some hard numbers around all of this analysis.
All right.
What are some of the key statistics we should be looking at?
Okay.
And what's the broader market context?
Right.
So as of today, Ethereum's total market capitalization,
Okay.
and that's the total value of all the ETH that's out there in circulation,
Right.
is somewhere between $188.9 billion
Okay.
and $190.19 billion US dollars.
All right. What about the trading volume?
Yeah, so the 24-hour trading volume is pretty big, ranging from about 18.37 billion
Yeah.
up to 27.01 billion US dollars.
But despite the price drop, there's still a lot of activity.
Absolutely, yeah. And the circulating supply of Ethereum, the amount that's currently available is around 120.67 million.
Okay.
And it's worth noting that unlike Bitcoin, Ethereum doesn't have a fixed maximum supply.
Right.
So that's a key difference between the two.
Definitely, yeah.
And, when we look at where we are now compared to where Ethereum has been,
Right.
it's been quite the journey.
Yeah.
Ethereum hit its all-time high between 868 and 891 US dollars.
Wow.
Back in November 2021.
Okay.
And the lowest it ever traded at was way back in October 2015
Right.
at just 40 to 43 cents.
Wow. So that just shows the scale of growth we've seen in this whole crypto space.
Yeah, the changes in valuation have been massive.
Absolutely.
And of course, Ethereum, it consistently holds its spot as the number 2 cryptocurrency
Right.
in terms of market cap.
Yeah.
It's a very established player.
Absolutely.
And we're also seeing that Bitcoin's dominance in the overall crypto market
Right.
is currently at about 62.16%, and it seems to be increasing.
Okay.
So, this might relate back to what we were talking about earlier,
Right.
investors may be shifting some of their holdings between different cryptocurrencies.
Yeah. Definitely something to consider.
Yeah. And then just to give some broader economic context,
Okay.
it's always helpful to see what's happening in the traditional markets.
Sure.
So the S&P 500,
Right.
which is a key indicator of the U.S. stock market,
Yep.
was at around 5074.08,
Okay.
and the price of gold was at about $3028.22.
So these numbers can give us a sense of, what the economic environment's like that these cryptocurrencies are operating in.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's shift our focus a little bit to what might drive Ethereum's price in the long term.
Okay.
We talked briefly about Jeff Kendrick's $10,000 prediction.
Right.
But what are some of the, bigger fundamental factors that could influence its trajectory over the next, several years?
Yeah, I think, Ethereum's price history itself gives us some clues.
Okay.
As the second biggest cryptocurrency, its price movements have historically had a big impact on the broader market.
Right.
It often acts as a leading indicator,
Right.
When Ethereum goes up, it can pull the rest of the market with it. And the same is true when it goes down.
It's almost like the barometer for the alternative cryptocurrency market.
Yeah. And as we've said, the history of its total market cap also tells us something about its growth and adoption.
Right.
Generally speaking, a rising market cap is a sign of increasing demand.
Yeah.
And usage of the Ethereum network,
right.
For transactions, smart contracts, and all these decentralized applications.
Right.
And conversely, a falling market cap could mean there's less demand.
Okay.
But it's important to remember market cap is just one piece of the puzzle.
Sure.
And you have to consider other data too.
Right. The number of transactions that are happening on the network.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also insightful to just look at Ethereum's price on different dates throughout its history.
Okay.
This can help reveal longer-term trends.
Right.
Whether it's in a sustained uptrend,
right.
a bearish decline, or, periods of high volatility.
Sure.
But, and this is really important, past performance is not a guarantee of what's going to happen in the future.
Absolutely. It can give us some context.
Right.
But the future is always uncertain.
Right.
So let's dig a little deeper into what Ethereum really is.
Okay.
And the whole ecosystem that's grown up around it.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's maybe not as familiar at its heart, Ethereum is a blockchain platform.
Okay.
That lets developers build these decentralized applications.
Right.
And create what are called smart contracts.
Okay.
So a smart contract, you can think of it like a digital agreement.
Okay.
That automatically executes when certain conditions are met.
Okay.
And it doesn't need any middlemen. All right, so this is the technology that's powering so much of the innovation we're seeing in the Web3 space.
Yeah.
Things like decentralized finance platforms.
Right.
That allow people to lend and borrow money without a traditional bank.
Yep.
And then non-fungible tokens that represent ownership of digital art or other collectibles.
It's really been a game changer.
Yeah, and the Ethereum network itself isn't static. It's constantly being upgraded and improved through a series of changes they have planned.
Right.
We've already seen some big milestones like the merge.
Right.
Which was a big shift in how the network secures itself.
Right.
It moved from a proof-of-work system to a proof-of-stake system.
Okay.
And that proof-of-stake is much more energy-efficient way to validate transactions.
Okay.
And they've got even more upgrades coming down the pipeline.
Right.
With names like the Surge, the Scourge, the Verge, the Purge, and the Splurge.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. They all sound very dramatic.
They do.
But they're all designed to enhance different aspects of the network, like its scalability and its efficiency.
So that move to proof of stake was a really big deal.
Yeah.
Aimed at reducing its energy consumption.
Right, which was a concern with that proof of work system.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also to make it more secure against attacks.
Right. And ETH, the native cryptocurrency of the Ethereum network, has its own really essential role to play.
Sure.
It's used to pay for transaction fees on the network.
Okay.
Which are often referred to as gas.
Right, gas fees.
Yes.
I've heard of those.
And these fees are necessary to, make transactions.
Right.
And interact with those decentralized applications we've been talking about.
Gotcha. And how does new ETH come into being?
Yeah, so that's interesting.
Okay.
Unlike Bitcoin, which has a fixed limit on the number of coins that can be created.
Right.
Ethereum actually has an uncapped supply.
Okay.
So new ETH is created through mining rewards. So currently, miners, or validators as they're called now, under the proof-of-stake system, they receive 3 ETH for each new block that they validate.
Okay.
However, there was a big update called EIP 1559 that introduced a new mechanism where a portion of the transaction fees that are paid by users are destroyed or burned.
Interesting.
And this burning process could lead to what's called deflationary pressure on the supply of ETH over time.
So the total supply could actually decrease.
Right, exactly. And so this balance between the creation of new ETH and the burning of fees is something that economists and investors watch really closely.
Gotcha.
Because it can affect the overall supply and theoretically the value of ETH.
That makes sense.
And it's also worth remembering that Ethereum held an initial coin offering, or ICO, way back in 2014. And at that time, investors could buy ETH for just 31 cents worth of Bitcoin.
Wow.
Yeah, and the return on that investment since then has been huge.
So mind-blowing.
Yeah, it puts the price fluctuations into a whole new perspective.
Absolutely.
And of course, we can't talk about Ethereum without mentioning, the key people behind it.
Right.
Most notably, Vitalik Buterin.
Of course.
Who first came up with the idea.
Yeah.
And he, along with some other co-founders, they really lead the groundwork for this entire ecosystem.
Yeah, that initial vision they had, of a decentralized world computer, it's really resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure.
And led to this, really active and diverse ecosystem.
It's amazing what they've done. And over the years, there have been a bunch of other blockchain platforms that have been called Ethereum killers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, projects that, are trying to improve upon or provide an alternative to Ethereum.
Okay.
But despite all of that competition, Ethereum has consistently maintained its position as that leading platform for building decentralized applications.
It's really impressive how they've managed to, stay on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing, some innovative services built on top of Ethereum as well.
Right.
Like the Ethereum Name Service, or ENS.
Oh, yeah.
And you could think of ENS as the Web3 equivalent of the traditional internet's domain name system.
Okay.
So instead of having to remember these long, complicated crypto addresses, you can just get a human readable name.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Like yourname.eth.
So it makes interacting with the decentralized web much easier.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about, making it more user-friendly and accessible to a wider audience.
Absolutely.
And we're also seeing growing interest in Ethereum from institutional investors.
Okay.
And this has been, potentially driven by the possibility of a spot Ethereum ETF.
Right.
So an exchange-traded fund that would actually hold Ether.
Okay.
And the SEC's approval of these 19B4 filings for these ETFs back in May 2024 was a big step forward.
Yeah.
But those S1 approvals, which are needed for trading to begin, are still pending.
Okay, so it's still kind of up in the air.
Yeah, and the anticipation around those ETFs is definitely, another factor that's influencing Ethereum's price.
Right.
And the overall market sentiment.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's touch on some of the more recent news and developments that are happening specifically around Ethereum.
Okay.
So there have been some reports about a big holder of ETH.
Okay.
Often called a whale.
Right.
Who reportedly lost over $100 million worth of Ethereum.
Wow.
Because of this recent price drop.
Yeah.
Which, is a stark reminder of the volatility that's inherent in these markets.
Absolutely.
But on the flip side, maybe suggesting a belief that the price will recover.
Okay.
There are also reports of other big Ethereum holders actually buying up a lot of ETH.
Right.
Over 130,000 tokens during the same price dip.
So you've got people who are, scared and selling, and then you've got others who are seeing it as a buying opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah, it highlights, all the different strategies and levels of conviction in the market. And another interesting news, the fees for making transactions on the Ethereum network have recently hit all-time lows.
Oh, wow.
Even though the overall number of transactions on the network has stayed relatively stable.
Okay.
And that's generally seen as a good thing for users.
Right.
Because it makes it, cheaper to interact with these decentralized applications.
Makes sense.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Ethereum today, it's clear that we're in a time of big price swings.
Yeah.
That are being driven by, a mix of broader market forces, technical trading patterns that are giving us all kinds of mixed signals.
Right.
And an overall market sentiment that seems to be leaning towards caution at the moment.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And the short-term predictions for the price are all over the place.
Right.
Reflecting that uncertainty.
Yeah.
But when we step back and consider, the fundamentals of the Ethereum platform, its ongoing development through these big upgrades, the growing ecosystem of applications. Yeah.
And the increasing interest from these institutions.
Yeah.
It paints a much more, nuanced picture for the long term.
Yeah, for sure. And our goal today was really just to help you cut through some of that noise.
Right.
And highlight what we think are the most important takeaways from
Yeah.
all this information.
Absolutely.
Giving you a clear sense of what's really significant
Yeah.
in this current landscape of Ethereum.
I hope this has given everyone, some good perspective.
Me too.
So as you reflect on everything we've talked about today, the volatility, the many things that influence Ethereum's price,
Yeah.
the underlying technology, its evolution.
Right.
It really brings up a bigger question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Beyond the price speculation.
Right.
What does this deep dive tell you about the future potential and the challenges facing these decentralized platforms and digital assets in general?
Exactly. What are the real world applications?
Right.
And, potential disruptions.
That you find either, really compelling
Yeah.
or even concerning
Yeah.
based on everything we've learned.
Based on all this information.
Yeah. And we really encourage you to keep researching and thinking critically
Absolutely.
about this topic because it's so fascinating and it's always evolving.
It is. It really is.
So thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
It's been really interesting, and we'll see you next time.
All right, take care.
You too.